Hello and welcome back to Parc Fermé Parlay with Kieran Downey. We're here after the Belgian Grand Prix and we thankfully have a race to discuss because at one point it kind of felt like it might not happen. Although the weather radars and everything were pointing towards a break in the sky and, the rain sort of clearing away, all I could think in the back of my mind was that we were going to get another race like 2021, or the lack thereof, a race similar to 2021, where we basically got nothing. And I was really worried that the most interesting thing that would happen today would be the chaos that happened after the F2 feature race, where the winner of the feature race in Formula 2, Alex Dunn, was given a 10-second time penalty, thus demoting him and promoting Arvid Lindblad to the race win, who then got disqualified, so then Roman Stanek took the win. I thought that was going to be the most interesting thing that happened. And to be honest, it might still be that case because the race was a lot more interesting than I thought it would be. However, I could have used maybe just a sprinkling of rain towards the end just to kind of liven it up. We did when the race started, we did sort of come out of the bat flying, and then we sort of entered a period where everything was pretty chill, and I just couldn't help but feel we just needed a little shower to spice things up. However, I did enjoy watching it. I enjoyed watching the race. I thought it was a decent race, and I do, as much as it is annoying to see these huge delays to the racing and the start of the race and everything due to the weather, I do think it is incredibly sad that this is a track that is potentially going on to a rotational basis and that we're only going to get it every second year, because it is an iconic track. It is, I think, as Lewis Hamilton said, the only track where as a driver you feel like you're actually going somewhere. It's iconic, it's such a mixed bag, and it promotes so many different strategies and setups, and it is a fantastic, fantastic race. So it is a bit upsetting that that is potentially what's going to happen. And as I said, even with all the delays and everything to the proceedings, to the race, it still is class. Obviously, the start of the race was suspended. Halfway through the formation lap, they suspended the starting procedure, called a red flag due to the weather conditions. And I've seen a lot of, obviously, discourse about this online, and there's a few points I want to make. One, the wet tyres. Name something more useless in Formula One, because we never actually see them. And although there was standing water on the track, and yes, those wet tyres would have been perfect to get rid of them, it's not the only thing at play when they're looking at whether or not we can start the race. Obviously, one of those being the visibility for the drivers. And yes, we could have continued for a few laps behind the safety car. However, a lot of the drivers were reporting that the visibility was so bad, even Lando Norris, who was on pole, reporting that visibility was so low. So in the name of safety, I understand why they decided to red flag the race, even though these cars are just like massive hoovers and will clear any sort of standing water within a few laps. But I get it. And I also think, coupled with the lack of visibility on the track, one of the biggest factors in the decision making on this as to why we get a red flag and a delayed start and everything like this, that I don't think is touched on enough or at all by the commentators and everything when we're talking about these delayed race starts, is all to do with the medical helicopters. If the medical helicopter cannot take off and safely transport someone to the nearest hospital or anything like that, if that's not a possibility, then they cannot start the race. They just won't do it. And we've seen it happen multiple times before. It happened in IndyCar, I think, like a week ago. That's a huge factor in deciding whether or not these drivers are allowed to go racing. And it's just something that's so big and so important, but never really gets touched upon. And whilst we're all frustrated that we're sat watching nothing on our screens, and whilst the commentators are sort of calling for everything to get underway because, as Martin Brundle can point out, like, this is actually going to be fine now, can we get this underway? Multiple things feed into that, and low cloud cover and everything will stop a helicopter from taking off. So as I said, that's just a huge factor that I don't think is mentioned at all, really, when we're talking about this, but it's obviously huge. You also kind of have to feel really bad for the fans and everything when this happens, that spend a lot of money, make their way out to a quite remote track and endure these terrible conditions and get no real racing from it. Thankfully, this wasn't a repeat of 21 and we did get some cars on track. We got 43 laps out of 44 because when the race restarted, they had to do an extra formation lap behind the safety car, and that sort of knocked one of the laps off. We obviously got I think it was 4 laps behind the safety car before we got confirmation of a rolling start, and then everything sort of kicked off. All in all, it was 1 hour and 20 minutes before things got underway, and I genuinely thought it was going to be longer than that. Thankfully, it wasn't, and it's time for us to get into the thick of it with our race review, and kicking things off with Sauber and Nico Hülkenberg, who qualified 14th, started 14th, finished 12th, and Gabriel Bortoleto, who qualified 10th, started 10th, finished 9th. I have to say, I do think it was a very good race for both Hülkenberg and Bortoleto. It is a shame that Hülkenberg couldn't score points. He had kind of managed to gain a little bit through an early pit stop. Those that did pit early, fantastic choice. The effects of that we'll talk about more because there is some drivers that really benefited from that. So we'll talk about it a bit later. But he did get a bit of a benefit from that. Unfortunately, he didn't really have the pace in the medium tyres. We've seen that the mediums weren't great for some drivers, fantastic for others, but not great for some. They ended up doing team orders because Bortoleto was actually the faster of the car. His tyres were only a lap fresher than Hülkenberg's, but just the pace and everything that Bortoleto had was much better. Bortoleto obviously managing to score a couple of points. Hülkenberg finishing just outside. It is a shame that Hülkenberg couldn't really make up any more positions. I do think P12 was maybe the best that he could achieve. That being said, he had some fantastic battles out on track, and it's great to see that Sauber actually being competitive. I was really hoping for a double points for Sauber today. I do think it might have been on the cards. However, there's multiple factors that have played into this, and finishing 12th in these conditions, not all that bad. As I said, fantastic result for Bortoleto to score another couple of points. And I said it when we spoke about the sprint and qualifying, but the Sauber renaissance that we're having is just fantastic. And I'm so happy to see this team being competitive after a very bad year last year and quite a bad start to this year. And when we were in the delay for the race starting, I think it was Ted Kravitz spoke to Matteo Binotto about the team and everything, and he was saying that, Bortoleto has had a rough start to the year, but not because of anything to do with him. He was in a quite slow car, and the conditions in the team weren't that great, and, they're slowly beginning to turn things around. He's an excellent driver. He's putting in consistent, solid performances, and he's now beginning to reap the rewards of that with these points finishes. And unfortunately for Hülkenberg, who's doing the exact same, putting in great performances, being consistent, scoring points, unfortunately this is just one of these weekends where he didn't manage to score any. But great job from Sauber. Next up is Williams, and we have Alex Albon, who qualified 5th, started 5th, finished 6th. And Carlos Sainz, who qualified 15th, started from the pit lane, finished 18th. I have to say a brilliant result for Albon after a disappointing sprint race, finishing 16th. Yeah, 16th in the sprint race, to come in and then go and finish 6th. And a fantastic qualifying to get to 5th. All in all, a very positive weekend and a nice sort of bounce back from a few disappointing race weekends. Unfortunately for Albon, he was never going to get any higher than 6th. George Russell very quickly managed to dispatch of him using the very good Mercedes top speed just to quickly get him in the opening stages of the race. Albon could never really get back up. And that being said, Albon did have some fantastic fights out there, going into the pits, coming out and regaining track position. And there was some great battles out there. P6 for Alex Albon, fantastic result. And more of these, because it's, Williams have kind of slipped a little bit, and it'd be nice to see them getting back up there. Sainz, unfortunately, started from the pit lane due to the team breaking Parc Fermé to make PU changes to the car and doing some setup changes. Sainz was never really going to score any points today, I have to say. Starting from the pit lane, and yes, there's other drivers that start from the pit lane that managed to claw their way through the pack and go and score some good points. Lewis Hamilton, for example. Sainz was never really going to be able to do that, especially when they stuck him on those medium tyres. He really couldn't find the grip. The pace was dropping off. He was sliding all over the place. He was getting track limits left, right, and centre. I actually think he got a black and white flag. It just really wasn't the race for Carlos Sainz this time around, which is a shame for Sainz because he actually had a very good sprint race. He finished P6 in the sprint, and it seems that Sainz and Albon have just kind of swapped it this time round. A very poor qualifying from Sainz. They've then decided to get him into the pits to make some specification changes and PU changes, and then it was just fighting a losing battle, it kind of felt like, for Sainz through the majority of this race. What I will say is, throughout the sprint and throughout the Grand Prix, between both the drivers, there is some promising signs there. You know, a great result from Sainz in the sprint, fantastic result from Albon in the main race. There's definitely positives there that Williams can extract from this weekend and start applying into future races so that we can get that team back into more consistent points finishes in these future races to come. So I do think there is some positives for Williams to take out of this weekend. Next up is VCarb and Liam Lawson, who qualified 9th, started 9th, finished 8th, and Isaac Hadjar, who qualified 8th, started 8th, finished 20th. Lawson, I think, had a fantastic Grand Prix. Absolutely amazing. So good to see him scoring points. And it was kind of an unusual one at VCarb because Lawson was actually behind Hadjar. And when it came to those first set of pit stops, Lawson actually pitted first, which you don't usually tend to see. Usually whoever has the better track position will pit first, and then that means that when the second driver pits, there's no potential change to the track positions of the two teammates that are sitting so close together. Lawson pits first, and that early pit stop from Liam Lawson really helped him. Those that pitted early, and by early I mean like one lap, got such a bigger benefit than those that waited. And I understand that the teams might not have wanted to double stack, especially in a situation like VCarb, because they were so close together, and that's why McLaren didn't double stack. So I understand why we're not doing things like that, but it's mental how just that one lap made such a difference. Kept Lawson within the top 10. It kept him on track for scoring points. He did a phenomenal job. Well done, Liam Lawson. Great to see him scoring points. As I said yesterday, he has gone through a very tumultuous start to the year, starting off in Red Bull, being promoted, lasting 2 races, getting demoted, fighting through the embarrassment he probably felt, all the chatter online, the media attention around that, trying to rebuild his confidence back in a team that he didn't expect to be part of, back finding his confidence within himself, within the car, and now we're beginning to see the Liam Lawson that we were used to when he was stepping in for Daniel Ricciardo across the past couple of years. I expect to see Liam Lawson scoring points. This is not a bad car. I think he's just had some stuff to really sort of work through, and now we're beginning to see the potential of Liam Lawson. He's qualifying decent, he's scoring points. Long may it continue. Because VCarb is in a very tight fight in the midfield. They are 2 points behind Sauber. You know, Hulkenberg's P3 in Silverstone racked them a whole load of points that propelled them up the order. So they've now got 2 points ahead of them, kick Sauber. Then behind them, 5 points behind them, they've got Aston Martin. 6 points behind them, they have Haas. So there is a very tight fight in that midfield, and they need both drivers scoring points. Unfortunately, Hadjar finished dead last on the road after an incredibly strong qualifying, and that, I just feel really bad for him, to be quite frank. That is the difference in what pitting one lap too late can do to your track position. Hadjar pitted 1 lap too late to go onto the slicks. He then got the mediums, and coupled on to being late to get those mediums, then had absolutely zero pace out there. And because he's got no pace on these mediums, the team then have to pit him again, which shunts him right the way back down to the bottom of the grid. He's on the hard tyres. He can't get them really working either, and it just completely falls apart for him. Very disappointing Grand Prix for Isaac Hadjar, and through no fault of his own really. You know, the team don't want to double stack, which I completely get. There's very tricky conditions. The track is evolving and changing constantly. The mediums weren't a great tyre for this race, and by the time he gets the hards on, he's so far down the order, he's not got enough time to be able to get a proper fight back in and get any higher up. All just kind of went a bit tits up for Isaac Hadjar, which is a shame because, as I said, it was a very strong qualifying performance. Hopefully, and I mean, I can't imagine it would, but hopefully he just casts that out of his mind, comes into Hungary next week, ready to attack, ready to qualify decently, and ready to score some decent points again. Because, as I said, VCarb need all the points they can get in this incredibly tight battle in the midfield that will be ever-changing, I imagine, right the way down to the checkered flag in Abu Dhabi. Next up, we have Haas and Esteban Ocon, who qualified 11th, started 11th, finished 15th, and Oliver Bearman, who qualified 12th, started 12th, finished 11th. I actually thought there would be a little bit more of a discrepancy in the finishing positions for the Haas drivers. However, when I kind of look back at it, I understand why they sort of finished so close together. Obviously, these two drivers went for very, very different setups on the rear wing for this race. Esteban Ocon obviously went for the very skinny rear wing, very low downforce, perfect for the sort of straight line speed in the drier conditions, which we all thought he's going to be a very unhappy bunny when he gets out on that track. It's pouring a rain and he's got no downforce on the car. Whereas Oliver Bearman, after the sprint, heaps on a load of downforce, sticks on a load of rear wing, meaning that in these wet conditions, it was going to be a lot more favourable to him. Unfortunately, because of the delay to the start, a lot of those quite wet, tricky conditions that high downforce would have really benefited. Because we waited for that, Bearman didn't really get the full effect of that higher downforce. And because we're at Spa, where each part of the track, each sector has its own characteristics, you know, you're going down sector 1 and a low downforce setup really gets you some good speeds there. But then coming into sector 2, where you're coming back down the hill, it's twisty, it's a lot of corners, a higher downforce setup really benefits you there. So I can kind of see why Bearman and Ocon have finished quite close together. Bearman and Ocon were also both slightly late in stopping, getting that first pit stop in to get those slick tyres on. So that kind of hurt them as well a little bit. Not to the same effect, obviously, as Isaac Hadjar. They still managed to find a little bit of pace in those medium tyres, but not enough to try and get them at any real points today, or any points at all. What also really sort of hampered Bearman and Ocon, and actually those within the sort of lower half of the field, your sort of P10 down, or P11 down, was Pierre Gasly, who'd been sitting P11, really holding up a lot of the pack. He had a whole DRS train behind him. There was quite a gap between Gasly in 11th, and I can't remember who it was in 10th at the time, but there was quite a gap there, and Gasly was just kind of really holding up the pack, struggling himself, not really able to close the gap in front, but nobody could really get an attack in to get ahead of Gasly either. So I can see why neither of these drivers really managed to score any points. Speaking of Gasly, let's move on to Alpine and Gasly, who qualified 13th, started 13th, finished 10th, and Franco Colapinto, who qualified 17th, started 15th, finished 19th. As I said, Gasly was really just kind of holding up the bottom half of the pack quite substantially, and I don't know whether there was a bit of a feeling of, I can probably get P10 here, but to do that I need to not let any of these guys behind me through, so I'm going to hold them up just a little bit so that I can, you know, really secure my chances of getting a P10, and that he did. It's another point in the bag for him. Unfortunately for his teammate Franco Colapinto, who finished 19th. Now, Colapinto obviously started 15th. He'd gained a couple of positions due to a couple of the drivers having to go and start from the pit lane due to PU and setup changes and braking Parc Fermé. And I have to say, it was a pretty disappointing race for Colapinto, however, not unexpected. I didn't expect Colapinto to be able to fight his way up through the field. Not at a track like Spa, not in these conditions, and not in that Alpine. It's a tricky car. Gasly even struggles with it sometimes. It's just Gasly also has however many years more experience than Franco Colapinto in driving a Formula One car. However, it is just another week where Colapinto scores 0 points, and there doesn't seem to be any movement. It's not like he's started his tenure at Alpine replacing Jack Doohan, and he's down the bottom of the pack, and then each race weekend he's slowly getting better and better and better, to the fact that he could be getting a P10 some point and scoring his first points in Formula One for Alpine. He just doesn't seem to be able to get to grips with that car. And I don't blame him. As I said, it's a pretty tricky car to drive, and it's not the best of cars anyway. However, there's just no sign of him getting any better. And the question marks are there, and they will constantly be there until, and the question marks about Colapinto's future within the team will constantly be there until either he starts scoring points or he's booted. And I don't know what the situation obviously is there. There is rumours that Alpine are waiting till the summer break, and it's sort of a natural cut-off point, and they potentially might get Jack Doohan in the car, or they might look at the pool of other drivers that they've got and put one of them in the car. But it's just not working the way that anyone really expected when Colapinto took over from Doohan. I do think that in this amount of time, we did kind of expect him to be scoring some points, at least have something on the board, not sitting with 0 points alongside Jack Doohan. And I understand that we can't gauge these things, as I've said, on a short amount of races, but if that's the precedent Alpine are setting, then that's what we have to sort of play to, and he's not performing. And right now, Alpine really need him to start performing, because they are hurting massively by only having Pierre Gasly as your point scorer, who is able to score a couple of points every so often during a race weekend. They are sitting dead last in the Constructors' Championship with 20 points. Haas is sitting in ninth, 15 points ahead of them. And 15 points is not a lot in Formula One when it comes to the Constructors. However, it's massive when fairly regularly Ocon and Behrman can go and score points for that team, and only Gasly can score points for Alpine. So there will be, I imagine, some very serious conversations happening at Alpine as to what the best move is for them to get both drivers scoring points, because they cannot just have... They will finish dead last in the Constructors this year if they continue going the way they're going. Another team that really struggled out there, Aston Martin, with Lance Stroll, who qualified 20th, started 16th, finished 14th, and Fernando Alonso, who qualified 19th, started from the pit lane, finished 17th. Do you know, I have to say, that's quite wild. I've got absolutely nothing written down for Aston Martin, apart from the fact that Alonso started from the pit lane because they made changes to his setup and his PU components. Not a thing. Yeah, I don't think I actually seen them once, really, in the broadcast, apart from when they were maybe getting overtaken. An absolutely dreadful race for Aston Martin. Dreadful qualifying, dreadful race. They weren't actually that good in the sprint either, although to be fair, I don't think you can really use that as a comparative session, because nothing happened in those 15 laps. But an absolute awful weekend for Aston Martin, and it's just, I can't put my finger on what goes on with Aston Martin. It really confuses me, because we started off really struggling, and then we were bringing upgrades and things looked to be getting better, and then there was some issues that we're out with of sort of driver and team control that were sort of pulling them back down the order, and then we're fighting back up there, and now we're going and having terrible weekends. Like, there is no way in which I think that Aston Martin should be qualifying dead last on the road and then finishing outside the points. It just doesn't seem right to me, and especially because they were on an upward trajectory and it just seems to have really hit a wall and stalled. And I don't know whether they are one of the teams that is now fully diverting everything towards 2026, or whether they are still planning to bring some upgrades and everything to these cars. I imagine there might be one more, maybe, but is it becoming too late in the season? Are they having to divert everything? I don't know. Is that why they've stalled? I don't know. But they really just seem to have hit the ceiling and are just going absolutely nowhere, and it's depressing to watch. So yeah, an absolute shocker for Aston Martin, and I don't have anything else to say apart from the fact that it was a disaster. Next up, we've got Mercedes and George Russell, who qualified 6th, started 6th, finished 5th, and Kimi Antonelli, who qualified 18th, started from the pit lane, finished 16th. George Russell, who managed to sort of gain in the opening laps and then just sort of held steady in P5, as I said, using the top speed. Very, very impressive top speed of that Mercedes to get past Alex Albon going into Lacombe, and then just sort of held steady in P5. Obviously defended the position pretty well, but obviously couldn't get any closer to Verstappen to try and launch an attack there. Mercedes did double stack them for the opening pit stops, and there was all kind of chaos going on there. There was mechanics falling over, and I'm actually surprised that race control didn't actually note that and send it to the stewards, because it definitely seemed like something that the stewards would be interested in looking at. However, I don't believe anything came of it. I have to say, a solid result for George Russell. Nice to see him back in the points after a very disappointing sprint race and qualifying there. As I said, when we talked about the qualifying, I thought he was going to be out pretty early, managing to put a fight in, managing just to hold steady and keep that P5. So well done to George Russell there. Unfortunately, his teammate, a complete shocker of a weekend from start to finish. One of those weekends that will probably have left Kimi Antonelli feeling very, very down. Obviously, qualified terribly in the sprint race, didn't really manage to do anything in the sprint. Then we come to the qualifying for the main race, qualifies P18, gets put to the pit lane because they decide to make PU changes to the car, setup changes to it. He gets out there, he's never able to really go in and launch any sort of bid to try and get points. You know, it's not like Lewis Hamilton, who absolutely went for it. He really struggled out there, and I feel really bad for him. And I hope that this is something that Mercedes have sort of cottoned on to, because after the qualifying session yesterday, when he went into the media pen to start speaking to all the journalists, Craig Slater, what have you, there was tears in his eyes. You could see he'd been crying. He was wiping them away, and my heart just broke for him. This kid's 18 years old, and the pressure and everything that's on him is huge. And I hope that that is something that Mercedes realise and put the effort in and do the work to make sure that he doesn't let it get to him too much. That they put in the work and the effort to get him over this bit of a slump. And it is a slump. Every driver has it. It's his rookie season. There's going to be mistakes. These things are going to happen. And to sort of remind him of some of the incredible moments he's had this season in Australia, in Miami, these brilliant, brilliant moments that he's had, and put the work and the effort in to get him through this and get him back up into scoring points. I have no doubt that it is a blip. I just hope that Mercedes help him and put in the work to get him back on form. And I have absolutely no doubt that they will. I think he's got a very good support system within that team, especially coming from the likes of Valtteri Bottas. I do think Bottas will be there to help him. I think Russell will help him. I don't think they're just going to leave him. But my heart does break for the kid. Seeing him cry after the qualifying was just horrible to see. And it, as I said, it broke my heart. And then, unfortunately, it's just another poor result today. I really hope the Mercedes can help get him out of his... Maybe not get him out of his funk. Don't let him get into a funk. As I said, he's only 18 years old. It's his rookie season. Blips are going to happen, and I just hope that this doesn't become the defining moment of his rookie year in Formula One. These sort of poor races. I hope that in the latter stages of the year we can get back up onto form. Next up is Red Bull and Yuki Tsunoda, who qualified 7th, started 7th, finished 13th. And Max Verstappen, who qualified 4th, started 4th, finished 4th. Max's race to me is one of the most interesting, even though nothing really happened for him. You know, we all sort of spoke about the difference in setup of the car between the sprint race and the main qualifying session. You know, the sprint, he had a really low downforce setup, tiny skinny skis of a rear wing, and it obviously gave him a huge advantage over the McLaren, and he was absolutely flying. Couldn't really be caught. We then add on a load of rear wing, add on a load of downforce, because, you know, Red Bull are really preparing for the wet conditions. And I think you could tell that Max was very aware that what the delayed start to the race would mean, that he wouldn't get the full benefit of having such a chunky rear wing on his car and having all that extra downforce, because we were basically going to wait and do what the FIA tends to do. wait until the track is almost bone dry before sending the cars all back out again. So when the race start got delayed and, we were all sitting there and you could hear Max over the radio being like, this is ridiculous. Like, let's just keep going. A couple of laps behind the safety car, rolling start, we're good to go. I felt his frustration because all I could think about was, you've just added so much onto your car. They're going to wait until the rain is stopped, till the visibility is better, and that means the track will be a lot drier. And as soon as these cars are back out on track, the drying of it will really ramp up, and then you might not get the benefit of all that downforce you've added on. That being said, even with the high downforce setup, I did think that he would be able to sort of mix the McLarens up and sort of ruffle their feathers a little bit. I didn't think he'd get stuck behind Leclerc. I thought he'd be able to dispatch Leclerc very easily and sort of go and put an attack on them. And, they might fight a little bit and that'll bring them sort of closer to Verstappen. Never really materialised. He couldn't really make it past Leclerc. And Max really just spent 43 laps staring at the arse of Charles Leclerc. And to be honest with you, I can't blame him. But it's some solid points in the bag for Max Verstappen. And I did think he would be able to pass Charles Leclerc pretty easily and then go and sort of try and launch an attack on the McLarens, but evidently not. On the other side of the garage, what seemed to be very promising for Yuki Tsunoda really sort of fell apart. A fantastic qualifying result for Yuki, the best that he's gotten in Red Bull, and I've seen all the social media stuff that's like, kind of funny how on the first race weekend that Christian Horner is not team principal and Laurent Mekies is, that Tsunoda's P7 in quali. And whilst I don't think that is solely the reason, I do think there is a little bit of that at play. We all know that Horner wasn't Yuki's biggest fan and that he'd never really seen him as a Red Bull driver. And, that's why Liam Lawson got the gig in the first place. And unfortunately, he didn't perform and Horner was incredibly cutthroat and swapped them around. What I will say, however, is that with Laurent Mekies coming on board as team principal and CEO at Red Bull, there is a definite shift with that team. It just all seems just a bit lighter. Everyone seems to be smiling, and by everyone, I mean Yuki Tsunoda. He obviously has a very good relationship with Laurent Mekies, and I've seen things that there is like a whole new floor on Yuki's car that he wasn't originally going to be getting, and Laurent said, well, rather than giving it to Max, I'm going to give it to Yuki because that's what I'm going to do. And I do think that is something that Laurent Mekies will do, rather than having the team solely sort of geared behind Max Verstappen, which was very much the Christian Horner way of doing things, trying to even the playing field between the two garages. And it did seem that was the beginnings of it this weekend. Unfortunately, as I said, Yuki's race just completely fell apart. An incredible qualifying performance from Yuki Tsunoda, which was undone due to the call to pit on lap 12 just coming far too late, which meant that he joined the likes of Norris, Hadjar, Ocon in being among the last to pit on the following lap. And it just completely knocked him out of position, shunted him down the field, and he couldn't really climb his way back up into the points. And it's an incredibly disappointing situation. I imagine he's feeling incredibly frustrated with the whole thing. But unfortunately, that's just the way Formula One works sometimes. And thankfully, it's not a Yuki-specific problem. This is something that hurt quite a few of the drivers. It hurt Esteban Ocon, it hurt Isaac Hadjar not being able to get into the pits when they probably wanted to and pitting a lap or so late. Obviously, Lando Norris pitted late as well, but he was running second anyway, and there was quite a bit of a gap there, so he didn't hurt as bad as some of the drivers that were in the midfield that got absolutely shunted down the back. As I said, it's a very unfortunate result for Yuki Tsunoda, but I don't think it's the last time we'll see him in Q3 this year. I do think that we will begin to see more regular appearances of Yuki Tsunoda in Q3, scoring points. Next up, we've got Ferrari and Lewis Hamilton, who qualified 16th, started from the pit lane, finished 7th, and Charles Leclerc, who qualified 3rd, started 3rd, finished 3rd. An absolute stormer of a performance from Lewis Hamilton. Oh my God, we've been needing that. It's been a long time coming, and I'm glad that he finally seems to have found a rhythm with that car. He's not been the biggest fan of this car in wet conditions, and after a very poor qualifying and, quite poor performance in the opening stages of this weekend, I thought that he would struggle in the Grand Prix, but right out the bat, he was just picking drivers off. He had incredible pace in that Ferrari, and I think in like the space of a lap had picked off like 3 drivers into the pit, early pit stop, got the mediums on, and just absolutely sent it, and just was climbing his way up. To start from the pit lane and finish P7 is a phenomenal job, and he's absolutely buzzing by it. I was watching clips of him after the race when he was in and around the paddock and speaking to people. He's absolutely buzzing, and no wonder. Ferrari and Lewis absolutely nailed it today. They nailed it, and it's not something I'm used to saying for Ferrari, to be honest with you. I think the only frustration for Lewis is the late call to start when he'd gone with such a high downforce setup for the wet and he couldn't fully utilise it. And I think that'll be the same for Max Verstappen and everything like that. But there's every chance that had we started earlier, he may have been able to gain even more positions, because we all know what a master in the rain he is. He even said that he wanted to go into slick sooner. It just has all really worked in his favour, and I'm so glad that he had this performance. So glad. And I hope that this is now the beginning of some decent performances for Lewis Hamilton as he begins to find a bit of rhythm in that car. It did, however, feel like he sort of reached the peak of the performance within the car, and he wasn't going to be able to get any higher. You know, he sort of managed to charge his way up behind Alex Albon, and then he almost kind of stalled. He wasn't really able to try and put an attack in on Albon, just kind of clutching to the back of his gearbox. I did see some radio messages that Hamilton was being told to lift and coast, and that was happening through pretty much the entire race. Something that we see them telling Charles Leclerc a lot, not so much Lewis, but throughout the whole time they were telling Lewis to lift and coast. And I think it might have been to do with the plank wear and them trying not to get caught out by having too much plank wear and ending up with a disqualification after such an incredible result. But nevertheless, as I said, an incredible result. Absolutely loved it. So good to see, man. Oh, missed this. And then we have Charles Leclerc, who spent his entire race, just him and Verstappen, they're never beating these allegations, them two, with such a gap in front of them, such a gap behind them, that it was pretty much just those two on track together for the entire race. There was a bit of a moment in the ever-going saga of the Ferrari communication issues where Brian Botzi had sort of come over the radio and been like, you know, Verstappen is now here. And Charles was like, guys, just leave me alone. Just leave me alone. You do not speak to me for so long. And now you come and start telling me all this information. Just keep it consistent. Either tell me nothing or be consistent and tell me every bit. But you're doing my head in now, so just leave me alone. And I do kind of understand it. He is aware that Verstappen is closing in on him, and he is now having to concentrate and put in a little bit more effort to keep Verstappen behind him. It's just Ferrari communication things. The communication in that team's terrible, but positive result from both, and you know, a wee podium for Charles Leclerc and an absolute stormer of a race for Lewis Hamilton. And finally, the McLaren drivers, with Lando Norris, who qualified first, started first, finished second, and Oscar Piastri, who qualified second, started second, finished first. I fully believe that Lando lost that race on the rolling start. Now, I understand why he didn't want a standing start as they were sort of going through the laps behind the safety car. He had sort of moved on to the right-hand side of the track, which is the side of pole position, and had come over to say, I think we should do a rolling start. The track is not even, and the side that he would be starting on was, you know, still had a load of standing water on it. And I completely get ya. I'm all for it. I don't mind a rolling start. I would prefer a standing start, but I'll take a rolling just as long as we get this show on the road. The safety car peels in. We get a race start. Coming into turn one, Lando slides, losing him a little bit of time, allowing Oscar to get right up behind him. Oscar's done that corner perfectly. He's right behind Lando coming up Eau Rouge, round Radion, down the Kemmel Straight, and has got such a slipstream and has just got such a jump on him, manages to sail past him into Les Combes, and that is just him, he's gone. Opened up such a huge gap between him and Norris, and he just sailed away. Norris obviously had a few issues with his battery, not something specific to him that were affecting all of the drivers. There is that sort of issue where the cars learn where to harvest and deploy energy. And in the wet conditions, it does that differently. So on the race restart, they deployed so much energy, he lost a lot of the usage within the battery. It's then got to charge back up. We've seen it happen again later in the race when the conditions had dried so much that we were getting onto slicks and everything, that people's batteries were harvesting at, really awkward times. Max Verstappen struggled with that, and that's just because the car's then learning again where to start harvesting that electrical energy. Norris very much struggling on those opening inters. They were wearing very, very quickly. As I said, was a little bit later in pitting due to how close him and Piastri were. Piastri going into the pits first. And then they go on to the hards and make the call that he is going to go to the end of the race. And then there just sort of became this little bit of a cat and mouse between Piastri and Norris. Norris is obviously going to the end. Can Piastri go to the end on his medium tyres? And I'll talk a little bit about Piastri shortly in a second, but there was a real sort of back and forward between the two, and it was quite interesting to hear everything that Will Josephs was telling Lando about Oscar. And what I will say is Lando, again, really having to get some coaching from Will Josephs to try and close that gap to Piastri. And what then began to creep into Lando was a few mistakes. And I don't blame him, really, because he's on incredibly old hard tyres. The grip in them is probably gone. And there is just a few more mistakes creeping in. Quite a few laps, he was running wide, he was locking up, and it was really just sort of pulling him further back away from Piastri, and he was losing time consistently. And you kept hearing Will Josephs coming over the radio to kind of coach him and sort of bring him in. And there was a moment where looking at Norris on his hard tyres, looking at Piastri on his mediums, and you just kind of got the feeling that Norris really had carte blanche here to fire up his tyres and close that gap as much as he can, where Piastri didn't really have that luxury. Norris could really just go and put the attack in and push his tyres because he's on the hards and they'll go a bit longer. Whereas Piastri on these mediums really had to think more about his tyres. And in the closing stages of the race, it really felt like it could come down to a last lap shootout. And unfortunately, Norris runs wide into turn one again, has a bit of a slide, and at that moment, Piastri's gone and won the race. I don't think there was anything particularly wrong with Lando's drive today. I think he drove a very good race. I think he showed why he's a championship contender today, driving on those hard, doing a one stop on those hards, and really sort of keeping the race for the win alive. Unfortunately, he was just undone by some silly mistakes, which I kind of have come to expect from Lando, but I don't think it was a bad drive by any sense. On the other side of the garage, I think Oscar Piastri drove an absolutely superb race and showed us why he is the championship leader. My God, I am so impressed with Piastri's performance. Being right there and keeping it clean, being able to capitalise on Norris having a little bit mistaken the opening lap of the race, fully sending it, getting ahead of Norris, absolutely tanking it, dealing with the issues with the battery, getting over that, pitting early onto a medium tyre, and then seeing that tyre through until the end of the race for 30 odd laps? Very, very impressive. He looked incredibly confident on that opening lap, and actually pretty confident throughout the entire race, because he pitted onto the mediums, was looking to go to the end. We all thought, whoa, you're off the rails. Never going to happen, mate. You're going to have to pit again. And we were kind of getting to the sort of lap 27 plus mark, hitting lap 30, and the real thought that was going through my mind was, if Piastri had pitted at that point, the sort of lap 27 to lap 30 mark, he's going to have to reel in Lando to the tune of around 10 seconds. And then he was going to go and have to pass him. And that, I do think, would have been incredibly difficult. We only have to look to last year and look at George Russell's drive, where he was in the lead on a hard tyre that still had a bit of life in it towards the end of the race, and he was incredibly difficult to overtake. And Lando's choice of then going on to the hard tyre would have been an even better decision than the decision it already was. And as we come into the latter stages of the race, obviously, as I said, Norris could be not as aggressive as he liked, but could be a little bit more aggressive in trying to close the gap to Piastri, whereas Piastri had to really sort of be mindful of his tyres and not as aggressively try and open up a gap, because he would have just, his tyres would never have made it to the end of the race. However, as we got to the final stages, the closing stages of the race, you really just kind of felt that as every lap ticked away, Piastri just had this one in the bag. You know, the mediums were still hanging on. He was still putting in metronomic laps, and Norris was having to really sort of dig deep to keep it consistent with what Piastri was doing. And it really just felt like, yeah, this is Piastri's. And then we get to that final stage. Norris is closing in, honing in on Piastri, makes a mistake, boom, Piastri's the winner. As soon as Norris made that mistake, Piastri, he'd gone and won it. It was done. I think it was an absolutely brilliant race from both the McLaren drivers. Between them and Lewis Hamilton really kind of kept that race alive, gave us something interesting to really sort of focus on, because apart from that, there wasn't a load happening. Although we did get a fair few overtakes, which I wasn't really expecting. There was overtakes happening all over the gaff. But a really good race from both Lando and Oscar, showing why they are the two that are fighting for this championship. As I've said, McLaren have got that constructors wrapped up. They are 268 points ahead of Ferrari in P2. There's no one that is catching up to that now. Championship, McLaren. For the drivers, there's now 16 points between Oscar in P1 and Lando in P2. Verstappen is 65 points behind Lando Norris, and with quite a few races to go, anything can happen, so I wouldn't be counting him out to try and move a position up. I don't think he will win. Maybe he will, who knows? Anything can happen in Formula One, but it definitely feels like McLaren have got that constructors wrapped up, and it is between those two boys, potentially Verstappen, but I definitely feel like this is going to go down to the checkered flag in Abu Dhabi, and I cannot wait. The last thing I want to mention, just before we sign off for today, is that the TV direction for the Grand Prix was markedly better than whatever the hell was happening in the sprint race yesterday. And I'm not talking about the TV direction through that period of time where there was nothing happening because we were waiting on the race starting. When the race restarted, what we got was a lot of action on track that we got to see, a lot of the action in the pit stops, and very little friends and family and celebrities in the garages, which we got a hell of a lot of yesterday during the sprint. And it really began to bug me. I love Lando Norris's mum as much as the next person. However, I do not care to see her in the garage when there is a fight happening on track between drivers, no matter what position they are fighting for. Action on track should always take priority on the broadcast over celebrities, friends and family, girlfriends. I don't care. Don't care to see them when there is incredible battles potentially happening out on track. And I think it's a huge insult, especially to the drivers in the midfield, because I don't care whether you're fighting for the top spot for P1 or whether you're fighting for P7 or P13 or P18. I don't care. If you are fighting out on track for a position, I want to see that. I don't care about anyone else in the garages at that point. And even when the race finishes and we've got Lando crossing the line, I'm happy to watch Lando cross the line, and then that's it. If there's still battles out on track, I want to see that, which is what was happening in the sprint race yesterday. Instead, what we got was Lando's mum and Lando, and as much as it's a lovely moment and it's amazing to see, I would prefer to see that after everyone has crossed the line and all the battles are done. It really bugged me, the TV direction yesterday, and I'm just glad to see that we didn't have so much of the friends and the family and the girlfriends and the celebrities and everything this time round, because I was getting really bugged, and that's all I had to say. Maybe we've got a new TV director that's got a thing for mams. I don't know, but that is everything from us. We'll be back very soon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Love you. Bye.